All right, let me repeat the question since I just recorded. So we're going to start off with, how do these ranked choice options function in a vote by mail state? And is there anything significantly different compared to states that vote at the ballot box? All right, whoever wants to start.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Sure, can do. So with star voting, I think one of the big differences, well, obviously both ranked choice voting and star voting can be done with vote by mail. That's not a deal breaker either way. But one of the bigger differences is in the ballot formatting. So with star voting, you have a consistent ballot format, no matter how many candidates you have in the race. You've got a 0 through 5 star rating. And so it's a set number of bubbles. And that means that the ballot formatting doesn't have to change or adapt. And that same 0 through 5 is going to be enough that you can rate every single candidate. If you have 22 candidates in the race, I think a few of our recent local city elections have had fields that were that big. You actually can weigh in on all of the options, whereas with ranked choice voting, you're often limited in how many candidates you can rank. Like some places do 3 or 4. New York City does 5. The Bay Area, I think, you can rate 10 or rank 10 candidates in ranked choice voting. And so that ballot design thing is like trying to rank 10 candidates on a ballot takes up twice as much room as a 0 through 5 star rating.
You done, Sarah?
Yeah, I don't know if we want to, should I give a big speech or should we do more back and forth?
Yeah, I mean, Candace, I guess it would be nice to have some understanding of what the format is for today. Like, are we
Back and forth?
Sure. Okay. So I think I agree, Sarah. I think both theoretically could be used vote by mail. Ranked choice voting, we've seen, and we're still studying this because vote by mail in other places has just really started, where places have ranked choice voting, and we're getting more information on it now. But we did see a slight increase of the number of people who ranked candidates on a ballot versus just ranking one in New York City from the mail-in ballots. Now, I would be wary of saying that's directly because of vote by mail, because it tends to be people who vote by mail versus vote in person are different. So I don't want to overstate that, but I thought it was interesting. And I would assume this could be done for star as well, if the technology was designed as such. But I think ranked choice voting has the benefit of, if a candidate drops out of a race, for example, like the presidential primary, they were I don't have the number in front of me, but they were a very significant number of votes that were just wasted in the last Democratic presidential primary, for example, because people had voted for people who just dropped out of the race. And actually, there's an example recently in Moab, Utah, where people had withdrawn their names to the ballot, and their rankings were just automatically reassigned to the next candidate for the voters that had placed them first. So in the event that candidates withdraw during the very long, 3-week vote by mail period, it's really helpful for voters to be able to express some sort of choice when candidates might withdraw for whatever reason. And especially in races where there's only a single person being elected to a seat, if someone, God forbid, holds office who's no longer eligible for it, you have to redo the election. And that's an extreme example, but I think ranked choice voting has proven to do that. I'm assuming star could be adapted to do the same thing. So I think there's probably only benefits to either system in terms of vote by mail. And I don't really see any drawbacks.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's not one that I had thought of. Definitely with star as well. If somebody drops out of the race, you've already given a score to the candidates anyway, so you already have that ballot data, and you just tally it and find the best remaining candidate. But definitely vote by mail and preference voting, I think, are really important to have both, because anytime you're asking voters to research all the candidates and weigh in and have an opinion on multiple candidates, like I know for me personally as a voter, having the ability to sit down at the kitchen table and research my candidates and Google things and call up my mom and see what her opinion is just makes it easier to be an expressive voter or an informed voter. But Mike, on ranked choice voting and vote by mail, do you know how many candidates you would recommend allowing people to rank in Portland?
I mean, I think that's a level of nuance that I think would be required discussion with whoever's implementing it. I mean, that's not, I think I come from a perspective that community organizations and people who are involved in the day-to-day most affected by this should be making those kind of decisions, not me. I run a group that helps support advocates. I don't try and make those sort of nuanced decisions that affects those kind of people. I mean, I know that there are plenty of different views on that, but I think that that's where an in-depth discussion with the people making these decisions about like how many candidates and kind of analyzing that. I mean, I think you put out ranges from 3 to 10. I think those are generally what's looked at.
Yeah.
That I would defer to our partner organizations on what they thought best served their communities.
So that's interesting to hear. So in ranked choice ballots, there tends to be a limit. Like even if there's 20 candidates, there's like is that common, right? That like if there's some kind of limit of how many people you can rank?
It depends on where you are. Some places do unlimited ballots as well. That's a policy question, really. That like it's not like there isn't like a hard and fast rule. There's some places don't do limits, some places do limits. You'll find all sorts of flavors on that. I think I think Sara even pointed this out at one point to me, which was like there is research that shows that people sort of tend to top out around 5 people in terms of like how many preferences they actually really have and they're tracking on in a race. So that would be a ballpark place to start looking at that question.
But I know just in terms of pros and cons, if you don't allow voters to rank every single candidate, you get a higher rate of like exhausted ballots, people whose votes can't transfer because maybe the front runners weren't actually in their top 5 or whatever. And then so that's a reason you would want to let people, I mean, for outcomes, you want people to be able to actually rank every single candidate. But for like voter confusion and voter error, if you give people a sea of bubbles that's like 10 or 20 bubbles long, you get a lot of mistakes. And it's easy to mess up a ranked ballot because you're not allowed to give equal rankings or equal ratings.
Yeah,
voter exhaustion, as I understand it, is one of the points that people raise. Apparently, when they do have 5 choices, something like 10% of the people actually don't fill out all 5. They'll rank maybe the top 3 and then not the rest. Is that an issue at all, like voter exhaustion in general, to kind of touch upon what you mentioned, an issue for from your perspectives at all?
I think it depends. Partially, that's a function of voter education and voter engagement with the race itself, which is not a function of the election method used. Part of it is also voter education on why ranking or whatever is important. So I think you'll see people filling out ballots at well into the 90% races, ranking their candidates on ranked choice voting in areas where voter education, most of the modern places where this has been done, you'll see even first time that it's used, it's in the high 80% of people ranking multiple candidates or filling out a ballot completely. And it usually goes well into the 90s once the voter education has been done, which is like far better of an outcome than we currently have as well. So I think that there's a focus on quote unquote exhausted ballots, but I think that that's somewhat of a hyper focus on an area that doesn't really show the fact that it's immensely better than what already exists in a lot of places. And that a lot of voters will choose to not vote all the way down the rankings list because they don't have an opinion on the other people. I think we see some of this with star voting too, where, people don't have a preference at the end of the ranking results or their scoring results as well. I think Sarah's other point of like, if you can only rank 5 out of 20 candidates and then none of your picks is in the top 20, I think it sounds terrifying, but it's like if you're going down to the 6th or 7th or 8th choice of a candidate, I don't think that you find in reality, like there's the on paper version and there's the reality version of like voters at that point aren't like hyper obsessed with their 8th choice. And that you're going to find undervotes and less engagement with ballots under plurality in the first place than you will with people getting their ballots exhausted under a ranked choice voting system as well. Like you'll find more engagement from voters overall using a ranked system, and we find this consistently across where it's used, than we do under plurality. So it's like our current system is terrible, and then this one has some imperfections, as all voting systems do. But it's so much massively better, and it engages so many more people, especially people who traditionally don't participate in much in the process. And I think that's the key point to keep in mind.
Yeah, so I agree with most of that. I mean, I think just to add a little more detail to it, I mean, there's two phenomena. There's like voter exhaustion, where you're like, oh, geez, there's so many candidates, I'm tired. But what we're really talking about when we talk about ballot exhaustion is a voter whose vote isn't able to transfer. And that's a vote that's not counted in the deciding round in a ranked choice voting election. So that's something that doesn't happen in star voting. And the semantics are unfortunate, because in ranked choice, an exhausted ballot could be either a voter who like literally just didn't rank either of the finalists on purpose because they didn't like either of them. And in that case, like that's totally fine. That's a vote of no preference. I didn't like either of them. But sometimes ranked choice ballots have exhausted ballots where the voter did have a preference, but their down ballot candidate was already eliminated, and so their vote can't transfer to that person because that person's gone already. So it's not the same as a vote of no preference. It might have been a ballot where if those rankings had been able to count, then they could have made a difference or should have made a difference. And I'm just going to do a really quick screen share. I have, let's see, I have a few slides, but this is an excerpt from a peer-reviewed thing. I believe it's peer-reviewed, but it's a study on ballot exhaustion.
Oh yeah, I read that. Yeah.
Runoff. Mm-hmm. And the rate of exhausted ballots is between around 10 and 27% of ballots that are not counted in the deciding round.
Sarah, how many races what was the N on this study?
It was 4 races. 4 races in California and Washington.
Okay. Out of how many ranked choice voting elections that have been held?
I think that this one looked at races where there wasn't an automatic majority in the first round only. And there are other studies that, you know, these statistics are on point no matter which study you look at. There's ones that include more elections. And I've got a few more of these types of slides.
Another point about those elections, and I don't know if you want to address this, was that no one actually won the majority because there were so many exhausted ballots or exhausted voters that the person who won did not actually win by getting a majority of the actual votes cast.
Yeah, well, one thing I can say on that is that the idea of a majority requires like a binary choice. If there's 2 candidates only, you're always going to have a majority winner. But in a paradigm where there's 3 or more candidates and where you can show nuanced level of support or support multiple candidates, there are going to be some elections where there's 2 majority supported candidates. Or if we were like, you know, it's 5:30, I'm starting to get hungry. Does everyone here like pizza, or do people like Thai food? And just going out on a limb, a majority likes both in this group. So there might be multiple majority supported candidates. There might be no majority supported candidate if, you know, depending on who's cooking. And so no voting method can guarantee a majority, but what we can do is guarantee a majority preferred winner out of voters who had a preference. So
And I
star
think
voting does
that's an important point to note, is that like the majority of people had a preference is an interesting definition, because if, and I know that I linked the star and another analysis on the independent party election, which is the only election that has used star voting. And if you look at the Secretary of State's race, 30% of voters, I mean, it's not exhausted ballots, but did not count in the final round. They were marked as having no preference. So I think that that's something important to note, is that whether, like, I think Sarah's narrow study that gets thrown around a lot of like a 9 to some scary number, 20-something% of exhausted ballots, like there was a 30% no preference thing under star, where there was a bit of a strange outcome, which led to Kim Thatcher, I believe, was the independent candidate. And I think there's like, you know, there's a mathematical equation that explains why that happens, but it's also sort of, I think that they're two similar scenarios where it's like nearly a third of voters were counted as not having a preference in a final round, whereas I would argue that doesn't seem to really reflect voters actually having preferences over candidates in a final like runoff election.
Yeah, and if you look at the data analysis there, a number of those votes of no preference in that election, specifically the Secretary of State race for the Independent Party of Oregon primary, a lot of those votes actually were votes, people who had given both Kim Thatcher and the independent candidate 5 stars, or had given them both 3 stars. But some people had given both 0 stars. A lot of the voters who preferred a Democrat had given both kind of right-wing candidates 0. And so that's, I think, part of why that race had a big rate of no preference, is because it actually didn't follow that standard paradigm of the two frontrunners were not the Democrat and the Republican. It turned out to actually come between the independent and the Republican in that race. So a bit of a weird election. I think that was a cool stress test for star voting for an initial use. Most elections, that election had a big field of candidates, a very lopsided field with a lot more candidates on one side, and also like absolutely no way for voters to know which candidates were viable. And pretty much everyone doing that election had never heard of star voting before voting. But yeah, definitely a win. All 3 of those elections elected the Condorcet winner. So the candidate who was preferred over all others won all 3 races. And yeah, there's pretty in-depth data analysis on that does show that, in fact, star voting succeeded and elected the right people according to the ballots cast.
I think many would disagree, but I've sent some data along, and I don't think we need to harp on the point.
So let's get into some of the other questions. I mean, we're kind of just talking in general, but let's dive into some specifics. So curious about how these voting methods affect nonpartisan elections. Like, what are the differences in nonpartisan versus partisan?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can go. So I think the big difference is that a nonpartisan election has all the candidates on one ballot. So you're looking at a big field of candidates. So you want a system that can handle a big field of candidates. And basically, you want a system that's going to eliminate vote splitting and eliminate the spoiler effect. Really, the more candidates you have in the race, the higher the rates of vote splitting and spoiled elections are going to be. And also, when you get into really big fields of candidates, you run into voter exhaustion, where your voters might not be taking the time to weigh in on every candidate. And so on this front, I think, from what I hear, I missed your last meeting, but I heard that the charter reform is strongly considering like just eliminating the primary altogether. And I think ranked choice and star voting are like the only two voting methods that are up to that task. It's a pretty tall order, especially because Portland does have the biggest fields of candidates and the most competitive elections in Oregon. But star voting eliminates vote splitting and eliminates spoilers. And the way it does that, the reason it does that is because you can give equal scores to all the candidates on your side. If there's 10 fantastic candidates in a field that are all progressives, and say I'm a progressive, for example, then I could show I like all of these candidates at 5 stars, or I could show I like them all compared to other candidates. You can show that you support your full faction over the other side. And that prevents vote splitting mathematically. Whereas with ranked choice voting, you can, you're only looking at the first choice vote. And so the first choice votes could be split between all the candidates on your side. And you could end up, you can't see until you've tallied all the rankings which candidates actually had the most support. So you can eliminate somebody in the first round who actually, had a lot of first choice votes, but also way more second and third, fourth choice votes. And then the other thing on that, Equal Vote Coalition, I think you all know me as a star voting advocate, but our mission is just fighting for true equality in the vote itself, really eliminating this vote splitting and spoiler effect in general. And there are a number of systems that do that. Approval voting, you guys have heard of. There's also other ranked choice voting methods like Condorcet methods that actually do count all the rankings and that do allow voters to give equal rankings. So you could say, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are both first choice for me. They have the same platform, for example. And those methods are on par with star voting on this one. It's just the instant runoff ranked choice that I think Mike and that most places use. That's the version that does still have these vote splitting spoilers, or can, especially in competitive larger fields of candidates.
What I will say is that, so in nonpartisan elections, RCV has a really good track record of electing a very diverse slate of candidates to office who are far more reflective of the constituencies they've been serving or that they serve. We've seen a nearly doubling of women holding office to almost equity. It's almost 50% in a lot of places, going up from 25% in city councils in places that adopted ranked choice voting. And we've seen no matter almost what district type it is, we've seen BIPOC communities elect a lot more leaders under ranked choice voting. And I think to me, that's a lot of the core of the conversation of what's going on here. It's I think star voting is an interesting idea. I personally see some flaws in it. I personally have some philosophical disagreements with it, but I think at the core here, one of the things is star is an untested system. I personally, and I think we'll get to this later, see some ways to manipulate it pretty easily as a political consultant. Whereas ranked choice voting is incredibly hard to manipulate. And we have data on that. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence about that. And we rarely run into any problems where it's oh, there's a clear example of the person who wasn't wanted by everyone winning. A lot of these are academic theoretical arguments that there is no perfect election system. Occasionally things that are not perfect will happen, but we've seen a lot of really good, solid results on real problems in America from ranked choice voting. And I think that's why a lot of us are really excited about a reform, because it's something that's proven to do incredibly good things. And I sent again some of the data on this around. And I think another thing to sort of switch on the nonpartisan races is that, and this would hold true for star as well, I believe, which is that both systems you'll choose to entirely eliminate primaries is an option, which would save both the city and candidates an expense of running, which, primaries tend to be a more wealthy, more privileged group of people that are voting that then narrow the choices to ultimately are basically a predetermined winner in a lot of races in general elections. And in partisan races, that's even more exclusive, but even in nonpartisan races, like so few people vote comparatively in like down ballot races for like city council in the primaries. And I think the opportunity under either system to eliminate those is great for voters. It's great for the city. It's great for candidates. It's like really it doesn't hurt anybody. So I would totally want to, reiterate our support for the idea of eliminating primaries entirely and then switching to a ranked system. I think, those are the two big things here, which is like ranked choice voting is a long proven record of electing more diverse groups of people. And both systems, regardless of system, eliminating the primaries is a really good idea.
Yeah, just piggybacking on that, primaries are like predictably, notoriously older, whiter, and more conservative and more affluent voters than general elections. So right there, having the decisions made, whether or not you have a primary, we feel strongly that the important decisions should happen in the general election. And a race shouldn't be like over and done before people are paying attention. And so I think that is probably one of the reasons that ranked choice voting has been able to have like verified positive impacts on equity of representation. And so that's something that as another preference voting method, I think STAR would do the same. And that's definitely one of the big advantages that we see for both systems.
I will point out that our coalition, which includes like Apano, Cocoon, the More Equitable Democracy, Next Up, all don't think that STAR will provide greater equity outcomes and have some serious concerns with it.
On that, I do want to say that none of those groups have ever met with us. And when I finally did meet with Michelle from Apano, she let me know that they had actually gotten, they had already heard everything they needed to hear about STAR voting from Colin Cole, who's like an out-of-state FairVote lobbyist.
He doesn't work for FairVote.
He has for years and is one of the leading people of FairVote Washington. So I do think that if we had a chance to be at the table for that conversation, we have good answers.
Yeah, I know that there's like tension between the two methods. I don't get it personally because I'm not like an election scientist. So I'm just like, I literally don't know what it is. I mean, it all, I don't know. Like I need to read what you wrote, Mike, because I see a headline of how you game the system. I would love to hear that because I think that is something we should discuss. So, and then have Sara here to be able to talk about those concerns. So maybe can you talk a little bit about that, Mike, on how STAR can be gamed and why, and then Sara can reply.
Sure. And I would be interesting to hear Sara's point. And I mean that sincerely, because this is not like a scientific analysis. This is me talking as a political consultant who's worked on a lot of campaigns, and I've won a huge majority of those campaigns too. And one of the reasons I got into election reform is because I worked in politics, and that either you become a cog in that machine or you kind of throw your hands up and go, this is really terrible. And I, feel somewhat blessed because I was like, wait a minute, this sucks and it's stupid. So we need to fix it. And so that's how kind of I got into election reform. But I do have a background in looking at like exactly like how do I game the system? Like I've pitted two males against each other in an election behind the scenes so that my candidate, who was a woman, could run. Like, and did that very intentionally using tactics that involved like messaging and direct mail and things that like might seem like, I don't know if they're like morally reprehensible, but like they don't feel great after the fact, kind of looking at it. And that stuff is so common these days. And I think that's a lot of the problems that like Sara and I are both trying to solve, right? In this, and I look at STAR voting and I see people who are super into it and they've got like some really good arguments. We're trying to solve a lot of the same problems, but I think as a system, I'm worried about it being untested. And so anything I'm about to say, I'm going to put in the frame of, we don't really know because no one's run an election with STAR voting, but I, as a political consultant, would look at this and go, here are the things that I would try to do. I would try to tell my supporters, for example, and Sarah, please tell me if this is mathematically incorrect, because I'm not fully sure I understand the STAR formula, but I would try and get my supporters to rate me a 5 and everyone else a 0 to increase my score. I would then try and send messaging out, probably through dark money, so it didn't come from me as a candidate, to try and get people to rate my opponent a 5, but then me a 4 as a backup choice, to sort of bring up my average on the other end of the spectrum. And then I would also try and see if I can use my coalition or other dark money outside of my campaign to try and lower my opponent's scores by being like, vote them, show people you don't agree with Bob Smith's campaign on education or something. Say no to Bob Smith, vote 0, right? So I'd use lever points to try and drive my opponent's score down amongst undecideds, my score up, and my opponent's score down during my people, and then try and manipulate his voters to also rank me higher in a race like that. And I don't know if that's gamesmanship. I mean, you can kind of do this sort of stuff now. Gamesmanship it's sort of like a hard word to define, but I feel like all of that is not, it doesn't add to a system that improves the voter's experience or the positivity of campaigns. I feel like it's a system that would potentially reward people doing a lot of things to put on a happy face in public and then do a lot of nasty stuff in the background, which is sort of what we have now. And I feel like that sort of stuff is like definitively like risky to the point of it not being worth it in ranked choice voting, which is why we see a lot of candidates like collaborating in ranked choice voting. We see a lot of coalition building. And we see like a lot of things like, the New York race, I think, is a good example of people doing ranked choice voting wrong and then figuring it out at the last minute, where candidates suddenly realized in the last like week of the campaign that they needed to like form coalitions and like, well, if you don't vote for me first, vote for me second and vote for them first kind of stuff, which is what we see elsewhere. Under STAR, I mean, I could see a divide and conquer strategies like working a lot better. Because the scoring system allows for you to like kind of play with the averages rather than incentivize campaigning for like a slate. It incentivizes campaigning for bullet voting, which is like rating one person high and a bunch of people low, or trying to like manipulate your opponent's supporters into rating you slightly less high than them.
So, Mike, it's interesting you led with like, you're not sure if you understand the STAR algorithm. But STAR voting is a 2-round process. In the first round, you score the candidates and add it up. In the second round, your vote goes to the one finalist that you preferred. So the first round measures quality of support for the different candidates, and the second round measures quantity of supporters for each candidate. And pretty much all of the points Mike made are true for score voting, which is like STAR voting with no runoff. If you don't have the runoff, then yes, there are incentives to like not give anyone but your favorite support. But the fact is that the STAR voting runoff, your vote goes to the finalist you preferred. So whether or not your favorite can win, or whether or not any of your favorites can win, giving an expressive vote, showing your preference, showing your level of support for those other candidates is what ensures that no matter who it comes down to, your vote is going to go for the one you prefer and against the one that is, your worst case scenario. So I'm going to get back to the screen share here. With this one. Sorry, let me find the right page of it. So in terms of like negative campaigning using dark money, so that with preference voting, there's a really strong incentive to not like demonize the supporters of other candidates, because you don't want to alienate them. You do want their secondary support, if not their first choice support, for both systems. And so negative campaigning really does run the risk of backfiring and turning people off. And that's actually even more true in STAR voting. Obviously, if you have some like third-party group that's doing all the mudslinging for you, that's a little less transparent. But those are the types of problems that I think you would see kind of that the voting method can't solve. You need to get into money and politics to fight that type of stuff, independent expenditures. But in terms of if, I say, give me 5 stars, give everyone else a 0, voters who do that are forfeiting their opportunity to make a difference in that runoff, assuming their favorite didn't win. And so that's a big risk. So when we look at strategic voting, does it work or does it backfire? That's the scenario that we calculate. So this graphic is from Jamison Quinn, statistics PhD and election science expert from Harvard, who works now for MIT modeling COVID variants. But our current system is by far the most gameable. And that's why we see political consultants like Mike talking about intentionally running spoiler candidates, talking about intentionally, running mudslinging campaigns or kind of manipulating the narrative. Voters in our current system have to be dishonest. It's not safe to vote your conscience if you don't think your favorite can win. And the ratio for that is it's 17-1. You should be dishonest. And then if you look at score voting, which is kind of what Mike was describing with the bullet voting incentives, the ratio is 4-1, so way better. With IRV, it's 3-1. With star voting, it's a 1-to-1 ratio, which means that you could be strategic, but that's just as likely to backfire as it is to help. So for a voter, that's not good advice. The best strategy really is to show your level of support for the different candidates, show your preference order, give your favorite 5 stars, give your worst candidate 0, and voting your conscience is the best policy.
Sara, can you explain the math behind that graph?
Yeah, I can. Let me pull it up again. So I'm not a mathematician. I just play one on TV. But so let's see. And I think, let's see. So these models are from voter satisfaction efficiency graphs. And what that does is you take, let's see. So if you imagine a 2-dimensional political space, essentially you've got the right end of the spectrum, the left, you've got authoritarian, and you've got libertarian, for example. And you say, we've got a spread of voters, they're spread out across the political space, they have all sorts of a spectrum of opinions. A candidate who is centered right on the center of public opinion is the candidate who should win. And you can model voting methods by saying, this voter, let's say, here's the center of public opinion. This voter's over here, this candidate's over here, this candidate's over here, this candidate's over here. You would prefer the candidates who are closer to you ideologically and not prefer the ones who are further away. So you can say, for a ranked system, this one's my first choice, second choice, third choice, just based on the difference in political space from that person. And
so I'm going to throw out this. I'm a little bit limited for time here, so I kind of want to ask about what FairVote has said. They've listed certain things that they find with star voting that could be problematic, although they're generally agnostic and hoping one or the other advances. But they give the examples of the French election where there were 5 candidates. Everybody had about 20%, and I'm sure you're familiar with this. But Macron, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but the current president won, and against any other candidate, he would win. But at the beginning, all of them had 20. And so they're saying under Star, the other candidates would have an incentive to game the system by telling people to certainly vote 5 for them, but then 0 for Macron, and then 4 for another candidate that they could possibly beat. Whereas if they were head to head with Macron, like all the statistics say that they would lose. So would that be one of the ways to game the system under Star, knowing that you would lose against another candidate, either you or dark money or whatever, would advise people to vote 0 against the candidate you would lose against, and perhaps a higher, like a 4 vote for a candidate that you think you might be able to beat in the primary or the instant primary or what have you?
So there's a number of problems with FairVote's analysis there. One is that example is a choose one voting election. We don't actually have the full voter preferences. We don't know, what people thought about everyone else. Another issue is that with that strategy, kind of what you're describing, to paraphrase it, is like, I'm not sure that my favorite can beat this candidate, so I'm going to try and elevate a weaker candidate so that in the runoff, it's between my favorite and this like weaker person who wouldn't have been able to make the runoff without me. So in order for that to work, you need 3 candidates to be in like a near dead tie for first place, in terms of like highest scoring candidates. And you would need to know that even though this other candidate is almost as competitive, or it's like you think you can get them into the runoff, that they wouldn't actually beat your candidate too. So that's pretty much an impossible scenario. You would need godlike voter polling information to be able to say, this candidate can make it into the runoff, but not actually beat my candidate. And the scenario where you would do that, if you did that behavior, it would be highly likely to backfire and actually have that candidate beat your candidate. Whereas a safer vote would be to honestly show your preference order and your level of support for all 3. And I have another thing on my screen share for this one as well. So this FairVote article, and Candace, you were saying, there's some bad blood, there's some animosity between the different factions. And unfortunately, that has been true. In 2018, we ran a campaign for star voting in Lane County. And right as like the ballots dropped, FairVote put out this kind of hit piece article that made that point. And it actually made a bunch of counter, like self-contradictory points about, voters' behaviors. And so we reached out to them. James and Quinn from Harvard reached out, people from the Center for Election Science, the Center for Range Voting, Represent Us, all reached out to FairVote and said, hey, this is underhanded. On the one hand, you're saying you support either voting method, you want to see star voting tried. And on the other hand, you're kind of sabotaging it with this hit piece that doesn't really fact check. And there are great rebuttals online. FairVote refused to link them from their article, but we did launch into negotiations between 4 of the major groups in the space. Will Menta from FairVote Washington negotiated on behalf of Rob Ritchie, and we and these 3 other groups asked FairVote to take down 3 of these misleading articles, and they agreed that those articles were misleading, and they agreed to take them down on the condition that we made a number of edits to our website and changed a few graphics, which we did, but that article is still up. So the screenshot is it in writing, them admitting that that article was misleading.
That's helpful to know. I wonder if we could talk about, I think, one, thank you both for providing some background info that we can look at. Sarah, do you want to go ahead and send me that link to that PowerPoint you've been referencing?
Yeah,
so
sure.
that we can look at it. And I'd like to wrap up so that we can have some time as a work group to make some final decisions. For Brian and Vadim, it seems like Salome is not going to be able to do the homework like she said. So I'm going to need to put that in. So I want to make sure that our thoughts are accurate. So I would love for both Sarah and Mike to just do a final round of what's one reason that we should support your voting method of choice, and what's a counter argument for why you shouldn't support it. I would like to hear in your own words, like a pro and a con that you make about your voting method. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Whoever wants to go first.
After you, Sarah.
I feel like I've been kicking off most of the questions.
I don't think I think as quickly as you do, so it's really to give myself space to assemble coherent words.
Well, I'll take the compliment. So the reason I think you shouldn't adopt star voting is, like Mike said, star voting is new. It is one of the newest voting methods out there. It hasn't been adopted at the municipal level. It has been adopted by political parties, 2 different political parties at the statewide level. So it's not entirely untested. It's been used for tons of private sector elections at this point. But definitely, yes, if you guys are the first to do this, if Portland is the first to do it, it's a pilot project. It's brave. And I understand why you would be hesitant to not do it for that reason. And the reason why I think we should do it is really the same. Voting reform is like catastrophically important. It's the reason that we're not able to be effective on any other issue. It's the reason we can't hold politicians accountable when they do fail us. And I really see that failure tracing back to vote splitting and this electability bias. So for me, that's where I frame my problem statement. If I, as a voter, can't vote my conscience because I don't want to waste my vote on somebody who I don't think can win, I have to strategically vote for this electable candidate, and that just entrenches this glass ceiling and this broken political dichotomy where the power stays in power and nobody else can make an impact. So star voting goes the furthest to empower voters to vote their conscience, both with like a super expressive ballot and also with really good strategic incentives. Like I said, the incentive, and you can think about it logically if you're not a math person, but you do want your vote to make a difference in that runoff. And so you do want to show your preference order and your level of support. I want to be able to show, is my second choice great? Is my second choice, a lesser evil? That's data that matters to me viscerally as a voter. So I think the ability for voters to have that voice and to have that accountability to be able to vote down front runners on my side who I think can win, while still kind of like hedging my bets with like worst case scenario if it comes down to a bad candidate versus a Nazi, my vote can go to the bad candidate. I think that's really empowering to be able to vote your conscience and still have that safety belt. So, yeah, in conclusion, I think it's really important that Portland demonstrates some political courage. Star voting was invented here in Oregon, and it was invented for a reason. Ranked choice voting has been around for 150 years. It's been adopted a lot. It's been repealed a lot. It has a mixed record. It's elected a lot of people. But there's also kind of concerning data. Ranked choice voting has had a chance, whereas star voting specifically addresses the biggest concerns with ranked choice voting, the biggest concerns with score voting, with approval voting, and gives you this kind of best of both worlds option. So if Portland doesn't lead and do this first, I think the rest of the country is going to be in a much harder position than us to be that leader.
And guys, Sarah, Mike, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm going to read over Mike's email. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but Candace, I'm going to have to later on tonight fill out my portion of the worksheet. I got to run to a dinner thing. So thank you all. I appreciate listening, and I'll take everything in. Okay, take care.
And I'll email you guys my write-up too.
Oh, thanks. And I spoke with Mont as well. So we kind of talked about some of these issues over coffee, but thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Cool. I will say, I think one of the reasons that you might not want to adopt ranked choice voting is that the city is looking at a lot of change right now, and prioritizing which changes is going to be hard. Like going to districts, multi-member districts, eliminating primaries, adding a ranked system of voting. It could be a whole lot for a lot of people to take in. We've done some work raising money behind the scenes for community organizations to do education around the Charter Review Commission's work itself, and plan to keep doing so to like help voters make that transition after the recommendations are ideally passed as well. But I think that it's a challenge, and I think that that's a legit concern, is like, what is an overwhelming amount of change for voters? And especially in a time when voters, I mean, we all know what's going on around the country. We've got these like wahoos and yeehaws, like threatening county clerks and that kind of thing. We do not want to like overwhelm people with change and roll it out poorly in a way that causes people to distrust government and disengage even more. And I think that's a real unfortunate concern, because if you look at the work all of us have to put into like understanding these voting systems and understanding the difference between them, and then it's like trying to get that compressed down to talk to voters is going to be a real challenge that has real potential negative consequences if it's not done well. And I think that from my conversation with people on the Charter Review Commission, everyone is very aware of that. And that, you know, I wouldn't honestly want to be in your guys' shoes in many ways, because these are pretty heavy decisions to make. On the positive side, I think that Sara does raise some procedural concerns with like ranked choice voting. I disagree with you, like the number of repeals, because a lot of the repeals were back in like 1913, and they were very specific. There were like certain types were done because they'd elected too many people of color to office. A lot of those places have reinstituted ranked choice voting, such as Burlington, Vermont, just passed it again. Though I will say that both sides will say things, but Sara does raise some legit points. However, I don't think Portland is the place to try a trial experiment for a voting system that doesn't have any certified election results behind it. I've told Sara in private conversations, I do think we should try other election reforms, but I think Portland's a big place with a lot of real problems and a lot of people who are not being served by politicians. Like, I don't know, maybe Lake Oswego, like let's try it. But I think that there's a huge stakes here that like real people, and if it does turn out that there's things that the math models haven't thought of, that party primaries don't deal with, like hundreds of thousands of voters, and that people like me who don't have the same ethics that I hope I have get involved with it, I think there's a real danger that people can manipulate the system to be what they want it to be rather than what its proponents hope it to be. Whereas ranked choice voting has a really good long track record, and is continually being adopted across the country. I mean, there's something like 13 states with active statewide ranked choice voting campaigns right now. I fully expect that we'll have one or two more states by the end of 2022 using it statewide, and a few more in 2024. there's a reason for this, is because it works and it has really important equity outcomes. There's really important outcomes for voters generally. And there's a solid track record on both like the technical and training and implementation fronts of it with county clerks. There's national infrastructure for it, which New York didn't use, by the way, which is one of the reasons their rollout was a mess. And there's just a proven track record at the end of the day that voters love it. There's, 80 to 90+% of people consistently in exit polls prefer ranked choice voting to the way they were voting before, after it's implemented. I think this wasn't always true back in the day when voter education wasn't done as well, but now we've got like systems in place. We've got a lot of research about how to talk to people about this, and we've got national resources available to kind of help come in, support community organizations, and support people working on the ground to help educate voters on how to rank, why to rank, and how to use it, and help city and county clerks implement the systems. It's not going to, nothing's going to be flawless. It's really challenging to transition anything to a new system at this scale. But if this were 20 years ago, I would say it would be very hard. But now I will say that like the money's there, the help is there, the language is there to get this done. And I really think Portland is a prime example of a place that needs this kind of reform because of the slew of candidates running, because of our messy political system, and because I think it's a chance to do something like multi-winner ranked choice voting. So RCV and proportional representation mixed together, which is a phenomenal way of electing people. And I think that that's something, we've been advocating for, is not just ranked choice voting, but PR mixed with ranked choice voting. So the multi-member districts and ranked choice voting. And that really is a phenomenal way to elect representatives to ensure everybody's voice is heard as much as possible in city government. And I'm really excited about like Portland, the city I love, with this absurdly dumb way of governing currently, really taking the next step and putting something together that speaks to all the people in our city that exist today.
On that last thing, I would love to see the charter reform have a dedicated time and space to talk about single winner versus multi-winner versus proportional elections, because ranked choice and star voting can both be used in any three of those contexts. And I think the pros and cons are pretty similar, either one, in some cases. But that is a whole separate, really important decision with strong pros and cons that I don't think we've had time to cover. Equal Vote supports star voting for single winner districts, simple star voting in multi-member districts, like for each quadrant of Portland, for example, having a couple of candidates elected in a bigger district to increase voter choice. Or proportional representation in multi-member districts using star voting. And I think there's really important considerations for local representation and simplicity and transparency on the one side. And obviously, I think everyone sees the benefits of proportional representation just in terms of allowing everyone to have a voice at the table. But there are some trade-offs in terms of accountability as well. Like if you only need 10% of the voters supporting you to win a seat, that means over 90% of voters would need to oppose you to get you out of office if you fail catastrophically. So there's a lot there that I hope you guys will not be pushed into rushing through. And then definitely in terms of what Mike raised about overwhelming Portland voters with too many reforms at once, I think adopting a more expressive ballot is one big thing that voters can wrap their heads around. And doing that in like a single winner district is just really simple and straightforward. Like star voting in single winner districts is very clear, it's very transparent, it's one election. In some ways, it's simpler than our current convoluted system. And then that sets a really good foundation to later upgrade to proportional representation when voters have the chance to really focus on that without also trying to think about pros and cons of districting and pros and cons of ranking versus rating.
Thank you both. I have one last question, Mike. What was it that the New York, why was it a mess? I didn't understand that.
So I mean, if you haven't been following it, it's not. I don't think it's super relevant, but
Relevant.
what is it?
Very relevant.
Well, I mean, it's relevant in that it was a poor rollout of ranked choice voting to the candidates and through so the New York election system, it's like it's known for its corruption. It's like where you dump your cousin and give them a state paying job and they don't do a lot of work, and they refuse to all outside help from like the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center or others to like come in and help them do it. So like they completely bungled, like they've like forgot to take test ballots out of the initial counts that they reported publicly. They reported publicly results before the results were finished tabulated, which I don't think is a great idea in the first place. Like it was basically I don't think this is not what would happen in Portland because we have an excellent county clerk and elections officials, but like it was a bit of a mess in terms of like the implementation. It was a kind of a classic case of like what not to do with it when implementing any kind of election reform. So I would look at it as like a boogeyman story for like what happens with corrupt government and poor rollouts and people are insular and don't take advice, and not so much like a warning story about election reform in general. You know, no one worked with the candidates to be, even the existing mayor was like, guys, start working together. This is supposed to make positive campaigning. So like candidates that were similar were like kind of nipping at each other when they kind of figured out at the end, like, oh, this is a really poor idea. It makes me glad to not live in New York, I think is more the case.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you both so much. Very helpful, and the time you took to answer our questions here and in writing is very appreciated. I think that, you know, I'm not sure where we all land on what we want to recommend back to the commission, but that meeting is, when is that meeting? When's our meeting, Brian? City council election. The 4th. So November 4th at 6 is our city council elections meeting where we're going to present back our thoughts, but our homework is due tomorrow. So that's why we're like making sure we get all that in. So yeah, I'm sure we'll have a big, robust discussion about it, but for you all to tune in that day, and if you're curious. So
what day is it?
November 4th at 6. And it should be all on our website. Cool.
Well,
yeah.
I'll send you my full write-up of the answers because I don't think we even hit all the questions.
I know, yeah, definitely.
And they were really good questions. There's a lot to be said there, and there's a lot of separate points. We didn't even get into like precinct summability and auditing and that type of thing, which, you know, if Portland adopts a new voting method and it works, the reason this is so relevant is that it could be scaled to, you know, statewide elections. It could be used as a model by other states. And so we do want a system that scales and can be secure at scale and that can be trusted at scale. So I think the New York election is really relevant in terms of how a bad implementation can backfire and erode public trust. And, you know, a lot of that was the officiation and not the system, but part of the reason maybe it didn't get caught is because the system's so complex. And also, I don't know if there's any justification for not deleting the test ballots at the beginning. Like that just sounds like straight election fraud to me from an inside perspective.
Well, as someone who actually knows about this stuff in terms of it, that's just gross incompetence. That's not fraud. Like these people were just factually just failing at doing their jobs.
But you don't do like a test election with the real candidates and the exact normal ballots. And then it was actually the candidate who caught the thing and was like,
yeah, it was a mess.
35,000 extra ballots in your tally based on our campaign's records. Are you guys sure about that?
Right. Yeah. And it's like, so if it was fraud, it would have been the world's most incompetent fraud, and why they would do it through a test thing. But yeah, anyways, it's really not relevant to Portland because this is the kind of crap that I don't expect our poor county clerk's going to deal with at all, or city election officials.
See that's an arguable point, but let's not belabor it. We get it. We'll just leave it at that. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time. Brian, if you want to stay on so we can just check in on the homework, but you two are free to head out. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for putting in the work, and I hope we made this dry topic interesting, but
Oh, it's interesting. It is.
Good luck, and thanks for the work that you're doing. It's super important. Take care.
Yeah, of
Thank you.
course. Thanks. Bye, y'all.
right.